Okay. You want to share the screen. Here it is. You see it? You see it?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. Is there any other image you want to show?
Oh, yes, I had this share screen, but it's here, it's up here.
Wait, I'm gonna close this.
Um, okay, so those are the two images I need.
Okay.
Just, I guess, leave it like that.
Yeah.
A little bit, yeah, like that.
Okay. So
Okay,
when you
I
go
guess
here,
we should go to Zoom.
yeah.
Yes, that's what I need.
Okay. You're unmuted, so they can hear what we're saying.
Okay, I'm just curious. Oh, this is going to be a lot better. No, the sound, I could see that.
And I can even adjust it here. So that it fits you. Yeah. Is that better?
Perfect. Good.
Okay.
I'm just going to get a little water.
You want a coffee?
I
Just water.
do you have some coffee?
Yeah. Yeah, I can make some coffee.
Okay. No, I think there's a cup of coffee upstairs.
Okay. Cold coffee.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Finally have feeling coming back to my fingertips a little bit,
Yeah.
but it sucks because now I can burn them.
Oh, shit. Yeah.
Oh, it's fuck. Oh, hold on.
Okay, here we go. So I upgraded my system over the weekend, and I think all's well now. Are there questions about where we're at, content or form, and so on? You were supposed to to upload your first assignment. I hope that that happened. Of course, if it didn't, you want to get in touch with me immediately by email. Are there any questions? Okay, very good. So we're going to press on now. We're moving on. Onward and upward. So I left off speaking about the Aztecs, and I want to finish that out and then look a little bit at the Incas, because these two they were empires, but they were veritable civilizations, in most aspects comparable to the other civilizations that we have mentioned. So to return to the Aztecs, the thing is that the Aztec civilization, like the Inca civilization, is what we call a Bronze Age civilization. They did not have iron. Iron ore civilizations began about 1000 BC in the Middle East and spread to Europe. But the Latin American civilizations were still at the level of the Bronze Age. They produced weapons and tools out of copper and tin rather than iron. And we'd have to say, of course, they were quite usable, but they were not comparable to tools and weapons produced out of iron or indeed even steel, because by the 16th century, the Europeans were beginning to produce steel. And that put them, of course, at a disadvantage with respect to the Spaniards. Another aspect, of course, was in both of these civilizations, gold and silver played a huge role. But interesting, not as money. The Incas essentially had no money. They used barter and kinship exchange as a way of exchanging goods or gift giving. And the Aztecs used, if you can believe it, the beans of chocolate, the cacao bean, as their money. They did not use gold and silver. Gold and silver was used as decoration, valued as such, but not as money. And of course, the Europeans were obsessed with gold and silver as money. This was the thing that drove them. So looking at the Aztecs, we can say the Aztecs who had come to, they were essentially an invading tribe who came in from the southwest of the United States in the 13th century. We're at the beginning of the 16th century. And they established their rule over the millions of other tribes and peoples living in the Valley of Mexico, which was very fertile, and therefore there was a very large agricultural population. And there were numerous towns, the most important of which was Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City. It had 250,000 people in it. Only Paris and Naples in Europe had populations larger than that. There was no city in Spain comparable. I left off speaking about this practice of human sacrifice, and I explained it was a way of intimidating the subordinated tribes. Are there any questions about what I've said so far? Okay. Now, this large population, of course, was supported by the most important product, of course, was corn, which, of course, is still the basis, the basic grain of Mexico and Central America. But there were many other there were many other plants, nutritious plants that we need to mention. Squash, potatoes, chilies, tomatoes, peanuts, chocolate. All of these were unknown in the rest of the world. They were indigenous to Latin America. They were unknown elsewhere. And of course, they provided a very nutritious diet for Mexico, but also important is the fact that these were now, with the coming of, the Spanish, all of these foods became known in Europe and Asia. And the modern cuisines of Europe and indeed China, the Isles of Indonesia and India were strongly affected by these new foods coming from Latin America. Now, all of this provided significant surpluses. The population produced the peasants produced significant surplus, which part of which had to be delivered over to the Aztecs as tribute, along with, of course, young men and women for blood sacrifice. And so this was a sort of foundation of the sort of class system, this surplus which was provided to the Aztec elite by the peasant populations of Mexico. And the rest of Mexico, of course, was organized into subordinate, what we can call tribal city-states, sort of the subordinated tribes with their own sort of temples, monumental buildings, and so on, but all under the control of the Aztecs. And in all of these places, of course, there was a kind of ruling elite, but also a great diversity of occupations. There were shoemakers, masons, furniture makers. There were weavers, spinners and weavers, a whole variety of different specializations, which provided what can be called manufactured goods, which of course, above all, were consumed by the elites, but also, as they could afford it, by the rest of the population. Finally, in terms of the Aztecs, one should mention, I showed last time, Tenochtitlan, and at the center of the city were these great temples. And so they had this monumental architecture. And the Aztecs, in terms of this architecture, the sculptures, and the ceramics that they produce, many examples of which have survived, are brilliant artistic achievements. And of course, are very valued by all over the world, but especially by the Mexican people. So that's briefly my description of Aztec civilization. Does anybody have questions about this?
I think someone had asked in the chat what maybe the Europeans were trading in return for things like chocolate and these manufacturers and stuff like that.
Well, the Europeans basically, once they established themselves, basically they took the place of the Aztec rulers. And so basically, instead of the ordinary people delivering the tribute in the form of all of these foods and other materials or labor to the Aztecs, basically the Spanish elite came to replace the Aztecs, and the peasant population was forced to provide them with all of these things.
So they took it. They stole it. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
That's right. That's right. Now let's turn to the Incas. And the Incas, in many ways, are very comparable. And you can see if you go to Peru, of course, there was this when the Spanish conquered Peru. It took them years to fully dominate, and there did survive in the sort of jungle area, up in the mountainous and jungle area, this Machu Picchu, which was a kind of secondary capital for the Incas, and it survived intact, largely unknown to the Europeans, until it was rediscovered in the 19th century. And this Machu Picchu, which is today a sort of UN sort of world-class sort of it's in a special category, is a site. Hundreds of thousands of tourists from all over the world visit Machu Picchu because it's a kind of preserved Inca site. So one could say that the Inca civilization was very similar to the Aztecs. There was a system of tribute. This agricultural surpluses were delivered to the Inca ruling class. There were towns and cities which had existed for centuries, if not millennia. There's a site that was recently discovered in Peru that they're dating back to 4500 BC. It is incredible. And so what I'm trying to say is the Aztec civilization, the Inca civilization, were veritable civilizations. They had writing, they had calendars, etc. So the thing that is most striking about the Incas is their welfare system. They, unlike the Aztecs, who were, I would say, rapacious and brutal conquerors, of course, the Incas enjoyed the prerogatives of being the ruling class, but they did provide for the ordinary people who did the work in the society, and I'll explain that in a minute. The Inca society was dominated, just like the Aztecs, by an emperor king. We saw, well, in Mexico, his name was Montezuma at the time of the Spanish arrival. In Peru, the Inca king was Atahualpa, and there were around him it's something like 1,800 male nobles who were the ruling class. These people were of pure Inca blood. You had to be of pure Inca blood to be part of this group. The Incas, like the Aztecs, had basically, they were just one of the sort of ethnic groups. They came to dominate this civilization in the 13th century, more or less the same time as did the Aztecs begin their rule. They essentially owned the empire. The empire was theirs, and they controlled all the important government posts, the army, and the priesthood, the official religion. They administered the religious rites, the central religious sites. Then below the Inca ruling class, there were what they called the adopted Inca peoples. That is to say, there were certain tribes, especially the nobles in these tribes, who were sort of accepted as kind of cousins, if you like, of the Inca elite. And they helped basically to carry out subordinate political functions. They were auxiliaries. And of course, the Incas did not practice human sacrifice. And so, of course, I think you can say that Inca rule was more benign. And that, of course, is especially established by virtue of the fact that, of course, if you look at where the Inca Empire was located, it was located in the Andes Mountains and the nearby territories. This enormously high mountains and hills and so on were at the heart of the empire. And then, of course, in addition to these great mountainous regions, there were some plateaus, there were agricultural valleys, there was part of the Inca territory ran along the seashore, even penetrated to the east of the Inca Empire into the jungles. So there was this very, very varied terrain, is what I'm saying. But a lot of people lived up in the hills and the mountains. Well, the Incas, they sort of imposed labor tribute on the ordinary people. And of course, they built their monuments, their big cities and so on, But they also, a lot of this tribute labor was used to set up a road system. They had a very good, in this very irregular geography, a very good road system built by the labor, of course, of ordinary people. And even in some places, they established irrigation works. And all of this, of course, tied together the empire and made it a little bit more productive. But above all, it helped the ordinary people. And this went a step further because the Incas, at various strategic points in the empire, they set up warehouses where surplus food and clothes were stored. And when times were bad, these were distributed to the people at large. In other words, they had a welfare system, which of course it didn't exist in Mexico, but the Incas, to their credit, ensured that every subject was fed and clothed. I would say, finally, that of course all this operated without any money. There was no money. It was all done through gift, tribute, the taking of tribute, the barter was extensively used, or various groups who needed things from other groups, say people who were living by the shore, who were taking fish, who might need potatoes. These kinship groups would be established, and people would exchange commodities, if you like, goods based on their need. So the whole system operated without any money, which is in itself an interesting fact. So does anybody now have any questions about what I said about the Incas? Okay, very good. So the question now arises, how come it was that the Spanish so easily overcame them? Well, the answer is basically in both the case of the Incas and the Aztecs is essentially the essential answer is that the peoples in these empires were divided. There was a lack of unity. In the case of the Aztecs, we've already seen many of the subject peoples used the first opportunity to basically overthrow Aztec rule because it was so vicious. But in the case of the Incas, there were some tribes who resented the rule of the Incas. There were divisions in the noble class. The ruling class was divided. And as a matter of fact, at the time that the Spaniards arrived, there was a fight for control between the different factions in the royal court. And so the Spaniards took advantage of these divisions, divide and conquer. They found certain allies. They played one group off against the other. I think this is the most important because if they had been unified, there were so few Spaniards. It's hard to see that how they, even with their superior technology, how they conquer. Now, the second most important reason, in addition to these divisions, was the European diseases and the die-off of the indigenous population. Now, the Spaniards killed a lot of people, but most of the deaths came from disease. I mean, we're familiar, happily, this COVID thing, terrible as it's been, they say 20 million people on Earth have died from COVID. But the die-off, we could say that the indigenous population of Latin America was about 100 million. Well, over the 16th century, 80% of the population died. and so they could barely resist the Spaniards. And as I said, it was only until the 19th century that the indigenous population recovered. Any questions? So then to complete this, of course, the last factor is, of course, the Iron Age technology, the superior weapons that the Spaniards had, the rifles, the swords, the cannon, and so on, and the sort of military organization. Of course, these were these were veterans of the Spanish army, and so organized. They were extremely well organized. So that's the way. This is my discussion of the Incas and the Aztecs. I want to now consider for a little while the establishment of the new Spanish Empire. How did the Spanish rule in Latin America? And this is an important subject because the Spanish rule lasted until the beginning of the 19th century, and Latin America is also Spanish America for the most part, and the Spanish influence is extremely important. So this is what I'm going to discuss right now. Now, we can say right away that the Spaniards, I'm looking for, I'm trying to bring up, I want to write. Okay, I'm just going to spell it out for you. Now, the Spaniards who came to rule over Latin America after the immediate wars of conquest, let's say about 1550, you can say that Spanish rule was established with some resistance across Central and South America. Now, the Spaniards came to be known as the Peninsulares. Oh, here. The cursor is stuck. So very quickly, a ruling class established itself over the Spanish Empire. And these people were known as the people from the peninsula. The people from the peninsula, meaning the Spanish Peninsula, Iberia, from Europe. And they, in Spanish, these people were called peninsulares. And these were the soldiers, the military men. These were the administrators, the colonial governors, and their immediate entourage. These were the clergy, the Catholic clergy, the administrators, the soldiers. They came from Spain. This was an opportunity for these people. And they were the ruling class. They administered over the peoples of Latin America. Below them, over time, a second or secondary elite, we can say, emerged. Now, these were white people born in Latin America. After a while, there was a buildup of the Spanish people. They married, they had kids, and these kids, they became ranchers and merchants or plantation owners. The Peninsulares were the top guys. They were the administrative class. And then the people who owned major economic assets were known as the Creoles. And these two groups were completely white of direct Spanish descent. And they intermarried. They kept aloof from the indigenous population. Oh, of course, they had their illicit relationship, but in terms of marriage and passage of property, they held aloof from the indigenous population. And these two groups, at the very top are the Peninsulares, below them are these Creoles, and they ruled. And I mention this because what we're looking at is a kind of racially based system of rule. White people ruled, and exclusively white people ruled over Spanish American society. And they kept it that way. That's the point. They kept it that way down to the present. That's the way it works in Latin America. In most of these countries, most of these republics, it's a white ruling class that dominates the society. Now, in the first instance, at the beginning of the rule of the Spaniards, they established a system of rule which was called the encomienda system, encomienda. And basically what this amounted to was that the conquistadors, the Spanish military elite, were all given huge estates all over Latin America. And these estates basically provided that the subject people, largely indigenous, had to provide tribute, especially in the form of labor, to the ruling class, especially as the Creoles were the sort of directly involved in economic activities, ranchers, plantation owners, ranch holders, people like that. And the provision of the crown was that in return for basically administering and controlling the population, they also had to ensure the instruction of the population in the Roman Catholic faith. The holders of these encomiendas were enjoined to convert and supervise the faith of the indigenous population. And we could say this system was at the beginning quite oppressive, extremely oppressive. It was a kind of form of slavery, if you like. And it endured for several generations. And ultimately, it sort of, because it was so brutal, it was gradually modified by the Spanish crown into sort of course, the tribute and so on, the control continued, but in a sort of a less severe form. The next major institution we should mention were the plantations and the ranches, which are still known in Latin America as haciendas. And they they, of course, based on the local geography, produced all sorts of things: corn, sugar. It depended on or cattle, and the labor force were either wage laborers or what we call indentured laborers. That is to say, people who owed money to the ranchers or the plantation owners. They had no money to pay off the debts, so they had to provide labor. So they were what we call indentured. So we have wage labor and the indentured system. Now, finally, we should mention the fact that the most important product produced by Latin America was gold and silver, especially silver. So the silver mines in Mexico and Peru were extremely productive, and thousands. I'm talking in Bolivia. Well, this is in Bolivia. There's a particular mine which is still in operation today. It's known as Potosi. And in the 16th century, 40,000 Indian miners worked at Potosi. Essentially, they were a form of wage labor. So we have then the encomienda system, the haciendas, and we have the gold and silver mines as the basis of the economy. And I would say this was an extractive and exploitive economy. There was no thought of economic development here. It was all about exploitation. And so what we have is a system where, on the one hand, Europe is accumulating wealth, accumulating capital, and Latin America is paying the price. And this system continued for centuries. It still continues. That's the way it works. So the last thing I would say about this before we begin to turn away is I wanted to talk a little bit more about the social system, because it's important for your sort of understanding of Latin America even now, is that, so I mentioned the white rulers, the Peninsulares and the Criollas. Well, below them, there gradually emerged a class of mixed blood people, mestizos, people of Spanish and indigenous blood mixed together. Well, they had white blood in them. So they were not as good as the whites, but they were better than the indigenous or the blacks. And these mestizos served as intermediaries between the white ruling class and the indigenous and black underclasses, because below are the majority are indigenous, and of course there are the black slaves that are brought in. And this is basically the setup. And of course, there's a certain mixing going on, but this system persists even today. So that's the setup. And I would merely mark, there was a kind of continuous underground resistance. The Incas, for example, or in Central America, there were Mayan priests or Inca priests who clandestinely would retain the old cults. The Inquisition would come after them and so on, but this persisted underground right through the centuries. And then you see toward the time of the French Revolution that there was more open resistance. And in Peru and in Ecuador and Bolivia in the 18th century, there were actually revolutions prior to the French Revolution. We can call them proto-nationalists. because their ideology was Incan. It was a revival, or attempted revival. I guess, does anybody have questions about what I've said? Okay. One last point is, of course, that we've already seen this, that in the Caribbean, Columbus and his followers killed off the indigenous population. Well, the Caribbean, like the coast of Brazil, more and more, well, sugar became, it was the biggest, the most profitable source of, it was the most profitable aspect of this transatlantic economy. And so sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Well, essentially, we're talking about black slave labor, ultimately 20 million imported, largely producing sugar, but eventually rice, cotton, what have you. So any questions about this? Okay, the last thing, of course, is Latin America is Roman Catholic. And Roman Catholicism was essentially the ideology of the ruling class, and it was imposed and ultimately, for the most part, accepted by the Latin American populations. And although some elements of Protestantism have lately appeared, Latin America remains overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. Now, it's important to understand that this religion was basically the ideology, because controlling people's minds is as important or even more important than controlling their bodies. If you can control their minds, you don't even have to control their bodies. They just do what they're told. And so this kind of institutionalized religion is extremely important in terms of the way these empires and indeed states work. Religion plays a very important role. And this is often referred to as the ideological state apparatus. That's a mouthful, but it's a useful mouthful. Ideological state apparatus is what we're talking about. And of course, it has bearing beyond what I'm telling you in terms of the particulars here. It's important to understand the ideological state apparatus. All states have their ideological state apparatus. In Canada, this is the public education system and the media. That's the ideological state apparatus through which the upper class rules the rest of society. That's the way it works. I'll say no more. Now, of course, what I'm saying is, of course, controversial and so on. I know that, but you have to cope with it if it's new to you. So now, of everything that was produced in Latin America, the most important thing, of course, was the gold and silver. And it was important because right through this period, from 1500 to 1800, up to 80% of all the gold and silver produced in the world, that is to say, the world money through which the world capitalist economy was created, was supplied by Latin America. And this was organized by the Spaniards very carefully because it was so important. Every year, the Spaniards would carefully organize the movement of gold and silver across these vast distances. It would all arrive, ultimately, most of it would arrive in Cuba. And then from Havana and Santiago de Cuba, the great Spanish treasure fleets, galleons, huge ships in convoys would cross the Atlantic to Spain, where, of course, the Spanish crown collected right off the top 20% of all the gold and silver went to the Spanish crown. So, of course, given this and given the Spanish infantry, Spain was the greatest power in Europe. Right until 1650, Spain basically dominated the rest of Europe. I'll have more to say about that later, but that's what you have to sort of take in. Now, having spoken about all this, do I have time? Yes, I do. I want to go to the review questions. I haven't forgotten the review questions because the review questions are the basis of the final exam. So we have already dealt with questions 1 and 2. I want now to answer questions 3 and 4. Questions 3 and 4 I'm dealing with. Does anybody have any questions about what I'm about to do or what I'm doing here? I'm giving you the review question. I'm giving you the answers, folks. Okay? So pay a lot of attention to this. This is important. So let me find my place. So the third question basically asks, the Portuguese Empire was essentially a merchant enterprise. That of the Spaniards, an affair of soldiers and priests. So what I'm asking you to do in this question is basically compare the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire. And the basic comparison, both of them were, of course, based on these ocean-going sea vessels. You want to mention, in previous lectures, I mentioned the development of the ocean-going sailing vessel. That was indispensable. But the essential difference between the two empires is the fact that Portugal was a maritime empire and the Spanish Empire was a landed empire. The Portuguese Empire was based on a relatively small number of people. Portugal didn't have a large population. It couldn't conquer the land. The Spaniards had 12 million people and constant stream of immigrants going from Spain, Peninsularis, to the empire. And so they could actually conquer the land of Spanish America and exploit the population. So it's a merchant empire versus a landed empire. So I want to speak a little bit about Portugal. The essential fact is a small population, less than 1 million. Now, of course, there were nobles and there were peasants in Portugal. Of course there were, but there weren't enough of them. There weren't enough to sort of follow the example of Spain. Instead, the Portuguese concentrated on developing their commercial and naval power. And I explained that once Vasco da Gama reached India, within a few years, they set up 50 forts all over Asia to try and control the Asian trade. And this in itself required an enormous effort. The Portuguese, as a result, neglected whatever agriculture they had. They completely neglected any kind of manufacturing. And the Portuguese Empire, although they did develop the sugar plantations. And remember, the Brazilian sugar plantations were Portuguese. But the Portuguese Empire was essentially, well, they couldn't keep controlling the Asian trade. They couldn't keep control of the world economy. It was beyond their capacity. And by 1580, the Dutch were moving in, the Dutch who proved to be far more powerful. And you could see this by virtue of the fact that they tried to exercise through their system of forts and strategic outposts to control the Chinese and the Indian merchants who were their Arab merchants who were their competitors. But they couldn't do it because there were too few of them and too many Asian merchants. They even, as I explained, at Goa, their capital in India, they actually intermarried with better off Indian merchants in an effort to sort of expand their population. They were not able to control the continuation of the trade through the Mediterranean and the Middle East. No, that trade continued really until, it was not until 1580 that the all-water route to Asia by the Europeans became the dominant route. The Mediterranean route remained open and lively until about 1580. So basically a sign of the weakness of the Portuguese. Furthermore, in terms of now this recalls the previous a question that was asked, the Portuguese did have to bring something to Asia in order to acquire the luxury goods, the spices, etc. It was gold and silver that they brought to Asia. But they also needed some manufactured goods. Well, the manufactured goods didn't come from Portugal. It came from the Low Countries. It came from Germany, where manufacturing was beginning to thrive. Northern Europe. In the future, that was going to be determinative in terms of the development of capitalism in Europe. And finally, I mentioned the role of the Jews, especially in Latin America. They forced the Jews to convert, but secretly they carried on, and they became a kind of underground merchant class within the Portuguese Empire. I'll turn to Spain and discuss Spain and how to answer that question in the next class. See you on Friday.